Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tombstone Tuesdays. I'm your host, Snider, and you can join me on the first Tuesday of each month for a half-hour chat about exploring historic cemeteries right here on Teal Gray's Para Mysteries Radio. This is my first show in a brand new monthly series, and in this particular episode, I'm going to be talking about cemetery safety and etiquette. Now, some of this is pretty obvious, but some things might surprise you. I will also reveal this month's cemetery symbol of the month, and if there's some time left over, I'm going to have a little story time. I'll share a cemetery tale. I'm going to tell you about the time I spent the night in a cemetery thanks to an incident at a fish sticks factory. Of course, that's if we have time. Now, since I'm currently traveling, this particular episode was pre-recorded. So I'm not live right now, and so you can't call in this time. But in the future, I do plan to have guests appear on the show, and I'll also broadcast live from various historic burial grounds so that you can call in with your own comments and questions, and it'll be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to developing this show. Now, historic cemeteries, this is a topic that is just endless for studying. I am constantly learning more about it. And I also learn from the people who read my books and the other people too. So I'm looking forward to this becoming a bit of a conversation between you and me, the listener. Now, I'm sure that some of you recognize my voice already. Not only has Teal Gray had me on her show quite a few times over the years, but I was also her sidekick for a while there on her show. So some of you are probably like, oh, yeah, I recognize this voice. But of you who are listening who don't know me, let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Tui Snider. I write books, I give talks, I take photos, and I do a lot of research. And it's really a good thing that I love exploring historic cemeteries because that is actually my most requested speaking topic. And I talk about a lot of subjects, but this is the one that I end up giving the most talks about. I've also written several books, including one that's called Understanding Cemetery Symbols, so that pretty much tells you what that book's about. I also have a graveyard journal that I made because, hey, I'm a writer. I love little notebooks. I love journals, and I think it's important to write things down. So I made one of my own I write down when I go on road trips. I keep track of the cemeteries that I see. And I have one that's coming out later this year that's called 6 Feet Under Texas. And this is going to be part of a whole series of 6 Feet Under books, which these are books that will talk about the history of infamous and quirky and unusual monuments and grave sites that you could visit, sort of, a guidebook for tombstone tourists, if you will. It's been a lot of fun to do this research. It's a really interesting topic, and I am open to input. So if you have ideas for things that should be in that book, you think, oh, I wonder if Tui knows about this grave or that interesting historic grave, then I'll tell you how to contact me later on. But I think I've done enough intro. Let's talk a little bit about the topic of cemetery safety. Now, as far as hobbies go, if you're like me and you like to explore cemeteries, then, we're kind of lucky. I mean, this is not as dangerous as, skydiving or surfing in shark-infested waters. However, own a set of dangers and considerations when you're visiting historic graveyards. First up, I like to tell people you got to avoid critters and criminals. Now, every graveyard is going to be different. But if you're, like when I'm over in West Texas and it's, a very sparsely populated area, that's when I'm keeping my eyes out. I'm looking for fire ants. I'm looking for rattlesnakes. I'm being careful in that regard. However, when I'm in an urban area, like I'm in a big city, New Orleans, or just any other big city really around the world, you have to worry about humans a little bit more than wildlife. So unfortunately, in some cities, the cemeteries can become havens for drug users and maybe even criminals. So you want to do a little research and always have a buddy with you. That's my next thing. I would say I never visit a cemetery alone, especially after dark. I mean, it just goes doubly after dark. But even during the day, I always have someone with me. If you get into any sort of trouble, it's not necessarily people. It's just if you're out there, you're out in a very sparsely populated area and you run into trouble, and there's no cell coverage, yeah, it's not good. So always take a buddy with you. Now, you want to wear sensible shoes. I know that seems obvious. And my idea of what are sensible shoes might be a little different than what your idea is. It's so hot here in Texas. I don't always wear closed-toed shoes. I have these sandals. They're like Skechers. They're really squishy, and they have a little bit of a heel, and they look cute, which is a criterion for me, but maybe not for you. I like to, wear something that looks a little cute. I could go to a restaurant later. But it gets you up off the ground is my point, because I don't want to be too close to the ground where there might be fire ants, and I want them to be stable. I always wear something that I could, not take off into a full sprint in, but, if I saw a snake ahead of me, I could get out of the way fairly quickly. So wear something, sensible shoes, whatever you think that happens to be. Now, here's something that I like to do. I like to carry a stick. I know that sounds silly. I don't usually bring my own stick unless I find one on my travels and I become particularly, enamored of this certain stick that I have. But when I get to an area, if I see a lot of tall grass and I think there might be snakes, I look around and find a dead branch that's kind of lightweight, and I use it to sort of sweep the ground ahead of me because I want to chase those snakes away. Most snakes, they are not out to get you. If you give them a little heads up, they are going to get out of the way. Another thing I do when I think there might be snakes around, and I learned this when I was a little girl, I used to walk to school, and there was a shortcut that went through a wheat field. But there were rattlesnakes that kind of liked to hang out in that shortcut area. So I would, on my way to school, I'd pick up a handful of gravel, and I would toss it ahead of me before I took the shortcut. And more than, there were plenty of times that I would hear a little rattle or I'd hear something slithering off. But, you give the snakes a little heads up that you're coming, then they are not going to bother you. One thing that's really super important when you are in a historic cemetery or even a modern cemetery is the monuments and headstones themselves. They can be some of your biggest dangers. So be extra cautious around large monuments, and if it's especially, I like to go to the oldest section. And so this is statuary that's been sitting out for hundreds of years sometimes. So it's not in a museum. It's not being protected. So it is out there exposed to the elements, and that's when, things shift. Stones fall. If there's a little urn on top of something, it might fall. All of these things, they can shift and fall without warning, especially if it's been raining recently. Pay attention to how squishy the ground is. When I tell people to be careful, I always think now when I'm out in the cemetery, I think about a news article I read a few years ago that's just really stuck with me. There was this guy, I think it was up in Connecticut, and he and his mother-in-law had a real contentious relationship. They did not get along in life. And even in death, he would go out, and he was known for, visiting her grave, and rather than making up, he would still just kind of vent and tell her hey, you gave me such a hard time or whatever. Maybe there were a few expletives. I wasn't there, but he was known for going and kind of venting when he would visit her grave. Well, one day he didn't show up when he was supposed to meet his friends for dinner or whatever it was, and his friends got worried, and they thought, oh yeah, he was going to visit his mother-in-law's grave today. So they went out there, and sure enough, they found him, and her headstone had fallen on top of him and killed him. So in a way, she kind of had the last word, and I know that's horrible to laugh about, but it's stuck in my head that, wow, I don't want my trip to the cemetery for pleasure and research to be my last, so I am constantly keeping an eye on monuments. Now, when you see those monuments, too, you might see some that are broken. Don't assume they were vandalized. Like I said, it's Mother Nature can really do a job on those. She'll knock fingers off of statues, and it's amazing how the earth can move these heavy stones. So, once again, this is another good reason to always visit cemeteries with another person. If something falls over or you get in trouble, you have got somebody with you. Another thing to keep in mind in cemeteries is you do not want to walk across graves. Now, there are a lot of superstitions around this, and in fact, I'm going to be joining Teal Gray on her show, Superstitious Texas, this coming April, and we are on April 16th, in fact, on her show, and we're going to have a whole show about talking about all the superstitions that you come across in cemeteries, so I'm going to spare you that right now, but there's a really, truly practical reason you do not want to walk across graves, because you don't want to walk, directly on the ground over a coffin, especially in older cemeteries, really, because those old pine boxes, old wooden boxes, they can disintegrate over time, and then your weight just might be enough to cause it to cave in on itself. And a few years ago, I was giving a talk at a monument builders conference. And these are people who, this is what they do for a living. And it was really fascinating to talk to them, and I learned a lot. But this one guy, he gave me quite a tale. He goes, I broke all the rules one day. I knew better, but I was in a hurry, and I knew we were going to have a burial out in this country graveyard that we didn't use too often. And I knew the water, I wanted to check it out real quick. So I just thought I'd swing by there. So he went. And he goes, I was kind of in a hurry. It was getting dark, so I did the exact wrong thing. I ran across the grave to get back to my car. He was a pretty heavy-set guy. And he goes, all of a sudden, he just felt this crunch beneath him in the ground. And he got, this exactly what we're talking about happened. I guess the coffin disintegrated below him. His leg got sucked in to the ground, and the water table was low. So he said he had boots on, and they filled with muck. And so he got totally stuck, and this is the days before cell phones, and he said, there I had done everything wrong. I had gone out there, I twisted my ankle, I was stuck in a grave, essentially, and he didn't know what he was going to do. And luckily, a woman came out there to tend some graves, and she found him and called for help, and they, he said it took a few guys to pull him out, and it was getting dark. So after I heard that, I took it doubly seriously. I'm really careful about walking across graves now. Another thing to keep in mind is if you're with children, it's okay to bring children to a graveyard, but you really need to keep an eye on them. Don't let them get off the designated paths. And as mentioned before, monuments really can shift, so you got to be super careful when you have kids with you. The same goes for your pets. First off, you want to make sure it's okay, to have pets at the cemetery. We'll get to rules in a second. But, even little dogs, if they're running around and they jump up on something, they could get crushed by a monument just as easily as you can. So keep them on a leash is what I'm saying if you're going to take a pet. And obviously, scoop the poop. That's it. I shouldn't have to say that, but sometimes, it's good to say the obvious. Now, as far as cemetery etiquette goes, first thing you do when you show up to a historic cemetery is you want to look and see if they have a list of rules posted by the front gate or somewhere nearby. And take a minute to scan these because sometimes there's some interesting things in there. Sometimes you can even find brochures to the historic cemeteries. I've been to a few where they had like a little brochures up in there, and if I hadn't gone to look at the rules, I would have missed out on that. Some of them will list that like every this day of the mid-May or whatever, every May 15th they have a decoration day where people come and they have a picnic. So you can get a lot of interesting information, not just rules when you go and look at the rules. Another thing is if you do see someone there who appears to be mourning, just leave them alone. Give people the space. Put away your camera and your notebook and just, hey, most graveyards are big enough you can kind of wander off and explore a different area until the other people are gone. Now, people don't always realize, another thing I like to say for cemetery etiquette is perfectly acceptable to enjoy a sandwich and have a few snacks when you're in a country cemetery or just in a cemetery in general. And I will talk about this more in future episodes, but a picnic in a cemetery is actually perfectly acceptable. And when you're doing this, you're actually taking part in quite a lengthy, a tradition that goes back centuries. So do that. And, of course, just be tidy. Don't leave any trash whatsoever. I mean, nothing, not even banana peels or cigarette butts. And, I mean, if you have to take a whiz behind a tree, take the toilet paper with you. Just be super polite. Now, if you're going to sit down, it's perfectly acceptable to sit on a bench. I know I sound like Captain Obvious here, but I one time, more than once, I've actually sat on a bench, and the people who were with me, who maybe they don't go to cemeteries as often as I do, were a little bit shocked. And I heard them, oh, Tui, you sat on a bench. I'm like, yes, I did. That's why it's there. So we will talk about benches and cemetery furniture a little bit more. My only caveat with this is just, once again, make sure that it looks, if it's a stone bench, it looks stable. You have to use your common sense at all times. Now, of course, it goes without saying that you really should be quiet when you're in a cemetery. I mean, it's okay to have a picnic, but you don't need to be rowdy and have, music blaring. It's okay maybe to play, a quiet guitar or a nice little instrument, especially if there's no one else around. But sometimes when we go to cemeteries, it's really hot. And so my husband might stay in the car while I'm running around. But he always keeps the radio volume down. You don't want to even, if you're listening to the radio in your car, you don't want it to be really loud. So be quiet. In fact, I was thinking how, Teddy Roosevelt used to say, speak softly and carry a big stick. I think that even applies to cemeteries, but in a different way. You want to speak softly, and you want to have that stick so you can make sure there aren't any snakes around you. Now, here are a few things that I like to take with me. I have my own little cemetery kit. And when I'm going to, explore a cemetery, I have a little canvas tote bag, in fact. And here's what I keep inside it that I find helpful. I have a whisk broom. Now, I'm not one of those people who, there are people out there who really are experts in cleaning cemeteries, like cleaning the headstones. And I love to see some of the before and afters of the restorations people have done. That's not me. I have not gotten into that, but I'd have someone who does that on the show sometime. But I do carry a whisk broom. I like to just, get the bird poop off and see if I can, if you're trying to read a date, you want to take a picture of a headstone, you can kind of just lightly use the whisk broom, lightly and gently. I'm probably more gentle than I have to be with them. But that's one thing I always have in my bag. Now, another thing that I just recently started carrying in my bag are light reflectors. There are these little, you can get them on Amazon for only like $10, and they help here's the issue. Sometimes you have traveled all day to see a historic tombstone, and when you get there, the lighting is awful. And sure, you can use your flash, but maybe that doesn't really do it. It's still not working for you, or you're still getting some weird shadows, or maybe you have dappled sunlight, which can be very challenging to take photos in. I love taking photos, but there are challenges specific. In fact, that could be a whole topic sometime to talk about taking photography tricks for taking good photos in cemeteries. I have a little parasol, and I've used that to reflect light on headstones before. But these little light reflectors that I recently got, I think are going to be wonderful. I always have a little packet of tissues in there, just because. And then I have a notebook. Now, I made my own special graveyard journal, which I do sell on Amazon, and I think it looks really cool. But you could just as easily have just any old spiral notebook and keep track of the cemeteries you visit and, the symbols you find there or the unusual, just any notes you make along the way. I find it, the handwritten notes are just easy. I keep it in my, in my little canvas tote bag, like I said. I also carry my own book, Understanding Cemetery Symbols, because there are a few that even I wrote the book, but I still sometimes like, oh yeah, what's that about? Especially plants. There's certain plants I forget the meanings of, so I double check in there. And also, if I think, hey, I come across a symbol, I'm like, I don't think I have this in my book. That's really exciting to me too, because hey, second edition, maybe I will have it in there. All right. So now we've gotten to the point where I want to talk about the symbol of the month. Since St. Patrick's Day is around the corner, I chose the shamrock for this month's featured symbol. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Now, England has its rose and Scotland has its thistle, but Ireland has chosen the shamrock as a national symbol. So when you see a shamrock on someone's headstone, it could possibly mean that they are of Irish descent. Before I get too deep into the symbolic meaning, I really want to clarify something. There's some confusion to clear up. You see, a shamrock is not the same thing as a four-leaf clover. And here in America, we often get that wrong. You'll see it on T-shirts and bumper stickers. But a shamrock is actually a three-leaf clover. It comes from a Gaelic word, which I'm really not going to even try to pronounce on the radio. The Gaelic words can be tricky. But the word means little clover or young clover, depending on whose interpretation you use. And clovers themselves, they belong to a group of plants that are called trifolium. So you've got a clue right there, since tri is Latin for three. So 3 leaves, that is a shamrock. So we got to get that in our heads. As for the symbolism, when St. Patrick came to Ireland, he used the shamrock as a way to illustrate the Christian idea of the Holy Trinity. And this is, all the way back in the year 431. So we are talking a long, long time ago. But St. Patrick, this is really clever of him, because clovers are so common that while he was talking to people, he could pluck a shamrock from the ground, and then he could explain that although each leaf of the clover was separate, all 3 leaves combine to create a single plant. So in this way, St. Patrick used the leaves of the shamrock plant to represent the concept of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that they're all part of the same supreme being. Now, I live in Texas, as I've mentioned before, and around here, when I'm out walking around, I'm on constant alert for actual living plants that have leaves of 3. Because in my neck of the woods, there's a saying, a lot of you have probably heard it, leaves of 3, let it be, because poison ivy plants have 3 leaves, and they grow in clusters like that. And you really don't want to bump into those. You're not going to be thinking about the Holy Spirit. You are going to be getting a nasty, itchy rash. So, when you explore historic cemeteries and you see the image of a plant or flower engraved on a headstone, and it has those leaves of 3, it's probably meant to represent the Holy Trinity. Now, even if it's not botanically correct, like you grow roses in your garden, but you may not necessarily, you'll see a little artistic license when someone has depicted a rose on a headstone. Quite often they'll have little clusters of 3. So they're doing that to be symbolic. They're not trying to make it, they're not trying to stick to the make it botanically correct. That's part of the reason it can be kind of hard to ID a plant on a tombstone, because there's a lot of artistic license involved. And if you scroll through the photos on the Blog Talk Radio show page, you're going to see what I mean. I have some examples there. I have photos of a statue of Saint, and then I have photos of just some plants that have leaves of 3 to symbolize the Trinity. Okay, let me look at how we're doing on time. I think I have time to squeeze in my little fish stick story here. I'll do my best. All right. So years ago, I was living up in a little town in Washington State, and I woke up, around 1 in the morning, and I was laying there thinking, why did I just wake up? When I noticed I heard a lot of car engines, and I'm like, why are people in my sleepy little neighborhood up at 1 in the morning? It's like on a school night, what's going on? So I look out the window, and I see cops going from house to house, but they skipped hours. I don't know why. So I run outside, and I ask what's going on, and people are like, neighbors are just hopping in their cars, and they're going, get to high ground, get to high ground. I'm like, what? And the cops go, oh, what are you doing here? You need to go to the highest point in town. Just get out of here. Go up on a hill. Go up north. I'm like, or was it south? I don't remember. But anyway, they told us which direction to go. And I'm like, why? And they said there was a accident at a nearby fish sticks factory, and there is some poisonous gas that, could be headed our way. I'm like, what? So I didn't waste any time. I woke my husband and my stepdaughter. She was about 12, I think. I grabbed the cat, and we all hopped in our car, and we drove to the highest part in town, which just happened to be the local cemetery. And this is, before cell phones and social media, so we had our blankets and we're all cozy up in the car. It was actually, like I said, it was a little comfy, and after a while, it was scary, and we're listening on the radio and hoping some poisonous cloud wasn't going to come our way, but they assured us it was headed the other direction and that it was something that was going to go low to the ground. So anyway, we just had to wait. We didn't know when it was safe or not to return to our home. It was a really dark night, I think, as I recall. And, eventually it started raining, and that was really peaceful. And I think the rain just lulled us all to sleep. I woke up after a while, and, my husband and everybody, even the cat, they were all asleep. Of course, I realized I had to pee. I'm like, oh, great. So I thought, well, I'll just do this really quickly, quietly. So as I was just kind of scooching out of the car seat, my cat, suddenly, she lets out one of those weird noises that only cats can make. I mean, it's like this crazy yowl. It's like, it doesn't even sound, I don't know, it sounds crazy. It's like, rawr, I don't even want to do it. But, and she leaped around me. Just somehow, I don't know how she did it, but she leaped around me. I see this shadowy shape fly by me in the inky darkness of the cemetery. And as I said before, I know better than to run in a cemetery, even in the daytime. I mean, I know better. But I was so freaked out about losing my cat that without thinking and like a total idiot, I sprinted after her. And, of course, I did not make it very far. I don't have the same night vision as a cat, obviously. I probably got 3 or 4 steps in before, it was smack. I tripped over a small headstone. It just clipped me in the shin. And I landed right on my face on the muddy ground with my mouth open. And I got a big old mouth of dirt, graveyard dirt. And I did not have my flashlight with me. It was all wet. And so I had to paw and crawl around on the ground and try to find, get my bearings back. I think by the time I got back into the car, I looked like someone who'd lost a mud wrestling fight. So, yeah, this was, the cat, of course, was nowhere to be found. Long story short, we did eventually find her about a week later. I mean, we drive up there every single night after work looking for her, and we found her and got her back. So it had a happy ending. But that's my story of how I ended up spending the night in a cemetery thanks to a fish incident. So now, if you have a cemetery story that you'd like to share, I invite you to call me or call into the show during future episodes. And I also invite you to contact me through my Facebook page. Or if you'd like to be a guest on the show or you have someone to recommend. I'm actually, like I said, I'm on the road right now, and I'm on a writing research road trip. So what I've been planning to do is to do some Facebook Lives from my Facebook page, which is called Exploring Historic Cemeteries. So go to that, just go to Facebook and type in Exploring Historic Cemeteries and scroll down, and hopefully you're going to see some goodies from my trip. I'm going to be going to some really neat ones here. Now, before I go, I'd like to thank Teal Gray again and the Paramystery sponsor, Be Healthy Nutrition in Granbury, Texas. Check her out on Be Healthy Nutrition on Facebook, or if you're in Granbury, just go to that shop. Now, even though I won't be here next week, I do invite you to hit the follow button here on Blog Talk Radio. Not only is that a great way to show your support, but you will get reminders for upcoming shows, and you'll never miss any of the goodies. Paramysteries broadcasts live each Tuesday at the same time, but each week is a different featured host and topic. Next week, for instance, we have Mark, the Fat Psychic. On the third Tuesdays, that brings you the father-son paranormal duo from RIP. That's Greg Stevens and Brandon Lee. And the fourth Tuesday is when Sister Sage arrives to share her astrological insights right here on Paramysteries Radio. So that's all I have for this episode of Tombstone Tuesday. I'm excited to bring you more in the future. Until then, happy exploring, everyone. And this is Tui Snider signing off.